Wait a second here. Let's see.
Peter, is everything? All right. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Welcome to the second installment of the Fall Faculty presentation series. This year, the theme is 9/11. This is the 20th anniversary of 9/11 this year, so that's what the presentations are exploring. My name is Joseph Hendricks. I teach in the English program and schedule and organize the presenters. So after the presentation, there'll be time for questions, comments, and if you're streaming, you can type your comments into the comments, and then we can read the comments and respond to the comments. There's some snacks over there on the table. I think it's some cookies and some sort of beverage. And since we're barring the snacks, since we're indoors and COVID is still with us, please, except when you're eating a cookie, you're fine. Keep your nose and mouth covered with your mask. So. All right, let me introduce our presenter, Joe Scheller, who's been with us since 2001, teaching media history and law, and teaching me Introduction to Speech, I think, in 2001 also, when I was a freshman here in 2001. Prior to teaching, Joe has experience as a newspaper reporter, an editor, and a business journalist. So please help me. Oh, and the talk is right here, Conspiracy and Misinformation. So help me welcome Joe Scheller.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Appreciate it. So the title of my presentation, and as Joe said, is Conspiracy, Myth, and Misinformation. It's not a coincidence that we seem to live in an age of alternate facts, where we seem to struggle as a culture to agree on just what the basic facts are. And it's not caused by 9/11, but 9/11 occurred in this country at a pivotal moment, and it certainly contributed to the kind of information and disinformation age that we live in. I enjoyed Dr. Jacobs' excellent presentation last week, in which he gave us some context for the background and the history of how 9/11 came to be. I think that my talk sort of nicely dovetails with that in a bit. I'm not talking about all of the broader cultural implications or political implications of 9/11. It's a big event, which is why we have a whole series of presentations on this topic. I'm interested more in what it shows us is a change point in our media universe, the way that we think about information, the trouble we have in terms of sharing a frame of reference on the world, the greater difficulty that we seem to have 20 years later of even being able to have conversations with each other in which our paradigms line up enough so that we can meaningfully exchange information. I'm not a pessimist. I think that this current age of disinformation isn't necessarily with us forever, but I'm also not a person that believes in easy solutions, and I'm going to outline some observations from a media professor on the reality that we're in and offer some reflections on maybe a path forward, but it's a way above my pay grade to try and solve big problems like that. And so I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to offer solutions, because I think big cultural forces aren't always subject to solutions. It's more like they're subject to understanding and coping and dealing with and moving on somehow, and that's kind of the spirit in which I want to speak. Ironically, today, I saw an Atlantic article called "What We Lost When Gannett Came to Town" by Elaine Godfrey, and she was actually writing about Burlington, Iowa, and the Burlington Hawkeye, and what she said had to do with the death of local news. And again, there's not a direct causal relationship, but there's a strong association with events that followed 9/11 and that were put in sequence for 9/11. Amongst other things, I'm going to quote briefly from Elaine's article here. Quote, "By now we know what happens when a community loses its newspaper. People tend to participate less often in municipal elections, and those elections are less competitive. Corruption goes unchecked. Costs sometimes go up for town governments. Disinformation becomes the norm as people start to get their facts mainly from social media." And although she didn't have the word quotes around it, I like to think of it as their facts. She also observes that in the most recent election cycle, there was a long-serving Democrat from Burlington who represented the Burlington area and the Iowa Senate who lost re-election that year, and he told her that he made something on the order of 10,000 phone calls to constituents while he was running for re-election, and it was the very first election cycle in which he remembered that nobody had anything to say about local politics, that the lack of a vibrant local media, among other things, meant, there's the old saying that all politics is local, and part of the shift in what we're seeing in our culture right now is that all politics are becoming national. And the response he got from a lot of voters in his district was, "You're a Democrat, and I can't vote for you because you're in the same party as AOC." Which I think must have been pretty disheartening for an Iowa senator who's not serving in the House of Representatives and isn't working with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But there you have it. The way in which we frame our discourse has shifted. Honestly, I don't want to mislead you. I'm not going to talk that much about politics. I had a friend, if you're watching on YouTube, Mike Miller, you might be, thank you for the hint about Scientific American. There's a writer there named Naomi Oreskes. Not sure how it's pronounced, but she does some interesting columns. And she did a column that ruminated a bit on why the rate of vaccinations for COVID are so much lower amongst Republicans and Democrats. And among other things, she said, is that polls show that for the most part, most of these Republicans don't think COVID is fake. Most of these Republicans aren't vaccine deniers. Most of these Republicans don't want to get vaccinated because the message about vaccination is coming from the federal government. And there's a sense that there's such a suspicion and a sense that science has been oversold by the federal government that they won't believe it because of that source. It's a difficult situation for us to deal with, although it's also true, as the scientists in the room I think would agree, that science isn't about big T truth. It's about a systematic way of thinking about the world and discovering what we know and always recognizing that what we don't know is always larger than what we do know. But if you're dealing with a natural phenomenon, like a new novel virus, it is the place that over time will reveal the best information to help you understand that situation. I'm not going to go deeply into, or even much at all, into Republican denial in the virus because it's a side thing. It's more of a symptom of the information environment we're in. So forgive the pun, but I love puns. I'm going to kind of ignore that elephant in the room and instead talk about other media and information realities related to 9/11. And primarily what I'm interested in is our tendency when we think about 9/11 and events since 9/11 to not believe what it is that we see, and to construct alternate narratives that tend to drive our conversations and that create parallel understandings that sometimes are so incompatible with each other, as I say, we have trouble even discussing these. And I want to start a little bit with the idea of conspiracy, because I think there is an important point to be made. It's something that I, as a communication professor, know. The idea that humans conspire is absolutely true. Now, our societies, our frames of reference, our understanding of the world are largely constructed by one of the most powerful tools we've evolved as a species, our capacity for symbolic abstract communication. And because of that, because that's probably the most uniquely human characteristic we have besides our wonderful opposable thumbs, we tend to share and withhold information all the time. And we tend to make sense of the world through even what Scripture called the Word. That in a deep sense, the way that we talk to each other infuses our understanding. We conspire all the time. We make deals, overt and covert. We remain faithful. We betray. We're conspiratorial social animals. But because we experience in our own lives conspiracy, it also means that we see and imagine conspiracies in a uniquely human way. It's sort of like the human cognitive disease of seeing the face of Jesus or any other human on rocks on Mars or in cinnamon buns, because we're so hardwired to get information from other human faces that we see them all the time where they're not. And I think conspiracies are a little bit like that. We engage in them, and we experience them, and we therefore see them, right? A lot of this is opinion. It's an opinion that has some basis, but I'll freely admit it's opinion. I'm glad that there's a psych professor. He can maybe tell me after the fact how much I got wrong about all that. Well, thumbs up so far. That's good. And besides being part of the uniquely human condition, something that's hardwired into our brains, one of the articles I read for this, I'm sorry, I'm a professor, so I'm going to get distracted sometimes, right? It was about why our robot overlords haven't taken over yet. Because we have advanced artificial intelligence, and our computer systems can do many things much better than human beings can do. For example, for many years now, computers have been able to beat the best human player at chess. Right? That's because chess, even though it has a very large number of permutations, has a very concrete set of rules. And more than a human brain can, a computer can predict all the possible future permutations based on the current move, which is basically what chess players do. In essence, what the point of that article, this is another one from Scientific American, the point of that article was that what is easy for computers is often hard for humans. But the reason the computers haven't taken over is what is easy for humans is very hard for computers. And it gave what I thought was a thought-provoking example that has to do with communication and what we're talking about now. A supercomputer is going to beat your buns at chess. But if it's trying to drive an autonomous car, it can't predict whether that old lady is going to try and cross the street. The human driver will beat the machine at what seems to be that very easy task. Because over millions of years of evolution, we have learned to tune into each other a lot. And at both the conscious and subconscious level, we're watching each other all the time. And there are nuances of each other that we don't even know that we're tuning into, that we are tuning into. And so what seems easy to us seems impossible to the machine, because it's not reading the natural nuances. And I think our communication and conspiracy ideas are like that too. You know, when we were in the jungle being chased by tigers, leaping to conclusions based on very limited data, based on what we told each other, was very much a survival tactic. And that's the way our brains are configured and the way we're used to thinking. The problem is in a cold medium like the internet, where we're divorced from the person who's telling us something, our brains are still leaping to conclusions when they shouldn't leap to conclusions. Anyway, besides being part of the human condition, I think that conspiracy is part of the American condition. I think it's honestly, and again, this is speculation on my part, big general speculations, but what are professors for? I think it's embedded in our American DNA, our cultural DNA. We have too many experiences over time of the nature of conspiracy. It has to do partly with the fact that we're the oldest functioning democracy on the planet. And democracies are run on conspiracies. They're a conspiratorial form of government. You know, if you kind of think about it, from a British point of view, there was a conspiracy of traitors that led to the existence of this country in the first place, but honestly within the country, right? If you read any of the stuff that went on at the time of Hamilton and the forming of the American Constitution, you recognize that there were all kinds of under-the-table deals and shenanigans and conspiracies going on. When the framers wrote the Constitution, they didn't imagine political parties, but groups conspired to create those parties, right? A conspiracy is part of the way that we live and part of the way that we govern ourselves. We've also just had lots of experiences in history that add to our conspiratorial thinking. Think of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. The Civil War itself a result of multiple conspiracies. You know, John Wilkes Booth, unlike Lee Harvey Oswald, conjecture here. A lot of evidence on my side. Some of you may think otherwise, and I'll acknowledge that. But in my opinion, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But we know John Wilkes Booth didn't. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. There has always been a suspicion that somebody knew more than they knew. And the usual conspiracy theory is that somehow Roosevelt was tipped in advance and allowed that attack to take place. That's a deeply embedded thread. As a person that has studied this question a lot, I tend to think that that's pretty bogus for lots of reasons. One of which is Roosevelt was an intelligent politician, but he wasn't a military genius. And the Japanese Imperial Navy, even though the British had attacked battleships in Italy, which is what everybody points out, they used a few dozen biplanes to attack a small number of ships. It wasn't the kind of general attack that we suffered at Pearl Harbor. That was the first attack of a fleet of that magnitude in world history. And yeah, I think Roosevelt probably was anticipating the Japanese might attack us. The whole American government was on edge, watching for what might happen. But the conspiracy that Roosevelt somehow planned and sacrificed people at Pearl Harbor, I think, is bogus. But on the other hand, Pearl Harbor does involve a bunch of conspiracy. Wars are almost always examples of conspiracies. In my speech class, I talk about Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The irony being that Admiral Yamamoto studied at Harvard and liked Americans and understood America and thought that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a really terrible idea. But he was in a group of war planners that conspired nonetheless to create this conflict. And so any big human conflict is fertile ground for all kinds of conspiracies and shenanigans. The assassination of John Kennedy. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of discussing that too much. I think forensic evidence proves that there was one shooter and 3 bullets, but I understand that lots of people disagree with that. Nonetheless, that happened in the early 1960s at a time when trust in institutions was about to be severely challenged. And I think that that's part of the reason why that particular surprising event has spawned so much energy and theorizing and second guessing. And honestly, theorizing and second guessing is not a dishonest or bad thing to do. What's bad to do is to weave too much of a conspiracy out of too little evidence, which I think happens too often. For many years, there was a suspicion that the main source used by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in their reporting of the Watergate scandal was a conspiracy itself. Many on the right suspected that there was no Deep Throat, that it was a fictional character that they made up. It turned out that Deep Throat did come out of the woods before his death and announce who he was. But that's one conspiracy theory. In essence, Watergate was a conspiracy. An example that in our form of government, conspiracies happen often. And it was a conspiracy that unraveled, which I think is one of the things that helps you discern whether a conspiracy is real or not. If it's large enough, it usually doesn't remain secret forever. There are signs of it. Many people don't believe we landed on the moon. I was 10 years old, I watched it live, we landed on the moon. We've proven it scientifically since then, but lots of people don't believe it. And most relevant to us, 9/11. I liked that you pointed out that it wasn't the first attack on the World Trade Center. I also recognize that for us at the time period, I mean, I vividly remember it was my first semester teaching. And I don't think we had class that day, but I know I had writing for PR that day, and I remember that afternoon we sat in the big circle and we just talked about this. And we forgot about the class for a day, which I think was appropriate at the time. But it was a terrible shock. I mean, maybe not as much of a shock as it should have been, but it was a terrible shock. And whenever you have a really surprising, terribly shocking event, that's when we want an explanation. We want to understand. And in reality, 9/11 was a conspiracy. But it wasn't the conspiracy that lots of people imagine, the inside job, but a group conspired to create those conditions. It had been conspiring for years, and it represented a successful attack. To be honest, to me personally, it was horrible that day that the towers collapsed. But it wasn't quite as much of a shock as I think it was to some people. It's a weird little thing. It's a personal thing. But two of my oldest sisters were engineers, and they went to Iowa State University in the 1970s. And one of my sisters, for a project in an engineering class in the 1970s, was doing a big study of fires in skyscrapers. And the problem was, how do you design escapes from very tall structures? And at the time, she said, one of the biggest issues they as engineers had was the nature of a steel skeleton building, right? Jet fuel will not burn hot enough to melt steel. It doesn't have to. You burn a fire next to a steel girder long enough, the steel girder doesn't melt, it just gets soft, and it can't support weight anymore. And what those hijacked airplanes did, as they splattered jet fuel all over a floor of the World Trade Center, and they burned enough that they weakened enough girders. They broke a whole bunch of them, and they weakened a whole bunch of other ones, to the point where then you had a collapse. The surprise to Osama bin Laden wasn't that there was a collapse. He thought that the buildings would collapse to the point where the planes were, and didn't realize that the weight of those collapsing floors from the top would cause all of the floors to collapse all the way to the ground. Anyway, back to my sister and her study in the 1970s. She said, if you watch a house burn, a wooden structure burn, it will collapse eventually. But until you get to the point where the fire burns enough that it literally destroys the wood will retain its structural strength. The problem with a skyscraper fire is that's not true in a skyscraper. The skeleton can be weakened by fire, and to the point where there's even the possibility of a collapse. And that's so engineers understood years before that this kind of calamity was maybe a possibility. And unfortunately, my sister in her engineering class didn't invent something that prevented that, but that's just a reality. 9/11 happened at a time period where media was entering a change point in its history. There have been multiple change points in media history: the invention of the printing press, the invention of the penny press, the onset of broadcasting, etc. What was the change point in 2001? What was going on?
The internet was coming in. People were using cell phones more often.
Absolutely. We were entering, the internet was a thing of the 1990s. People were very aware of the internet. They were starting to use the internet. The biggest thing in the 1990s, I think, was e-commerce. Right? It was the age of Amazon in a way. Social media didn't exist yet, and people didn't carry the internet around in their pockets yet. But the internet was changing the way in which people shared and got information. Right? Media ownership was also changing dramatically. In the 1980s, the Ronald Reagan FCC had removed many of the ownership limits on broadcast companies. In 1996, Congress passed a new communication law that allowed any kind of company to provide any kind of information on any platform. And as a result, by 2001, there's a frenzy of consolidation and changes in ownerships. And it's always been a problem in the 20th century in American media that there were too few powerful companies controlling too much. But honestly, when we left the 20th century and got to the 21st century, that problem didn't lessen. It got dramatically worse. And we're still in that era today. American news media was supported by something invented in the 1840s in New York City called the penny press model. And it basically meant that the media had discovered they could sell advertising and then sell their product, the information, very cheaply. And the New York Sun was the first newspaper to do it. They sold copies of the paper for a penny, which even back in 1844 was a ridiculously low price. But the reason they did it was because Benjamin Day, the brilliant publisher, recognized he could become a millionaire by selling advertising because he'd get a bigger audience that way. So the chasing of eyeballs and audience is a very old trend in American media. But with the growth of commerce on the internet in this new century, there are signs that that paradigm, which has lasted for 160 years, is shaky and won't last into the future. In fact, 8 years into the century, in 2008, there was a dramatic economic downturn that, in effect, most print media companies have not recovered from yet and probably never will. I'm not trying to promote the Drudge Report. It's part of an alt-right-wing media, but I mention it now because there's something important that happened in the late 1990s that showed the way in which the information environment was changing as a result of the internet. What did Matt Drudge do in about 1996?
Did he break the Monica Lewinsky?
Specifically, what he actually broke was the fact that there was some sex scandal at the White House that Newsweek was refusing to run a story about. But that became the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And it was a blog on the internet scooping the mainstream media on an important national story and reshaping the media environment. Little did I know that the psych professor would be there to give me the media content. So.
I can remember reading it on the Drudge Report at the time.
Okay. So we have the growth of the internet. And we start to see this new phenomenon. Here I've got all these fancy notes that I have been just yakking away and haven't even bothered to check them. One seminal moment actually happened in 2005. And I'm going to quote briefly from a New York Times article that was published this September by Kevin Rose, and it's about media changes related to 9/11. And it sort of sets the stage for what happened in 2005. Quote, the year is 2005. You open Internet Explorer and surf to Yahoo Mail and spot an unread email from a friend. You've got to watch this, the email said, something that was way more compelling in 2005 than it would be today. The link takes you to a website where the video starts to load. That video is an hour-long documentary produced with new computer software that allows anybody to be a video editor and create a program. It's a program called Loose Change. Have you ever heard of Loose Change before? What have you heard about it?
Very little. It's conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it basically brought together a bunch of ruminations about conspiracies supposedly surrounding 9/11. Its main thrust. It's hard to say what its main thrust was because honestly it's been redone over the years and there are various versions of Loose Change out there. But it was mostly the idea that the government conspired to create 9/11. And most of us didn't watch it. It was on something called, what was the site? Google Video, which was a competing service to YouTube before Google bought YouTube. And that was an example of what we think of as being common today. A lot of media and a lot of information and disinformation is spread by YouTube video because it's easy for lots of people to produce video. And the early influential example of that phenomenon is tied directly to 9/11 and is this documentary. And I think a lot of it stems from, what do we say today, that you should do your own research, quote unquote, although what people call research is typically not research at all. It is the need that we have to fill in the gaps. Again, going back to the way that our brains work. If we have limited information, we're going to read the tea leaves and get all the conclusions that we can because we don't want the python to get us or the tiger to eat us. But again, that instinct for millions of years not living in cities, and it isn't always serving us well. Okay, so where did you go, technology? There we go. All right, so partly what we see is many recent examples, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on a few of them. We all experience a lot of myths. Now, conspiracy ideas and theories existed in the past, you know, the Kennedy assassination, the space race, but they took years to spread, and honestly, there were a fairly limited number of them that were culturally important that people paid attention to. These days, they can become instantly popular, and people pay attention to lots of them. And one of the weird things about even trying to correct misinformation is that, you know, it's like whack-a-mole, because, you know, alternate theories will always pop up. I'm reminded of a column written in the Mount Mercy Times by our excellent editor-in-chief, Jada Veazey, who said, well, you said all along that you weren't going to take the vaccine because it wasn't FDA approved. Now it's FDA approved. What's the excuse you're going to use now? And the chances are there's going to be an excuse. Who's she? I was hoping that Department of Agriculture would be a strong hint. All right, I'll give you her name, and many of you will know right away what I'm talking about. Poor Shirley. She deserves to ring a bell, and she's not ringing a bell. In 2010, a conservative website called Breitbart News, which has become bigger since then, and it's a shame to me that it's become bigger, because their first big story turned out to be completely fake. But as part of the whack-a-mole age of disinformation that we live in, that doesn't always matter. She was the Community Development Director for the United States Department of Agriculture in Georgia, appointed by a former governor of Iowa named Tom Vilsack, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time. Because she was a fairly high federal official in Georgia terms, and a successful black woman in the South, the local NAACP chapter invited her to be the speaker for their annual banquet. That speech was recorded. A video of that speech made it to Breitbart News, and snippets of it were edited. In that speech, Shirley Sherrod did say, a white farmer came to me, and I had to ask myself whether I wanted to give him some help. And I decided I wasn't going to help him. And so the story broke on Breitbart. USDA official admits Obama administration is racist. Right? The problem was the rest of the tape surfaced. She was talking about the way she was thinking when she was working for a nonprofit agency in the 1980s. And as not a government worker, as a worker at that nonprofit agency, she had a white farmer come to her and ask for help during the farm crisis to keep his farm. And her first reaction, partly because her father had been murdered by a white farmer in the 1960s, was, I didn't want to help this guy. So she was telling this poignant story. The end of the story was she finally decided, I can't blame this guy for what somebody else did in the 1960s. I can't use his race and identity as an excuse. That's something we all have to get past as a culture. And in fact, she helped the guy and saved his farm. And she wasn't telling the story to confess that there was racism at the USDA. She was telling the story to say, none of us, black or white, has an excuse to engage in racist behavior. Completely different message. She was fired in the meantime by Tom Vilsack. Next day she was offered the job back, but then she was too bitter and upset and never went back to the USDA. But again, it's part of the quickness, the quickening pace of information and disinformation. The NAACP of all organizations condemned her for 24 hours because they didn't want to be associated with this apparently racist speech when it turned out there wasn't an apparently racist speech to begin with. Okay, this was in 2010. Around that time, actually in 2008, we had the birthers. Who were they?
They denied that Barack Obama was an American citizen.
They denied that Barack Obama was eligible to be president of the United States because clearly he was foreign. Well, gosh, he's got a name like Barack Obama, right? The Republican Secretary of State of Hawaii said, yeah, we have a birth certificate for this kid. His mom was from Kansas, was a student at the University of Hawaii, got pregnant, gave birth to a little baby boy in Honolulu. Right? The irony of the whole birther movement, well, there was all kinds of fake stuff. In fact, there was even a birth certificate that surfaced supposedly from Kenya, and part of the problem was it listed the name of the nation back at a time period when he was born, and it didn't have that name. It was a colony. So, I mean, the whole thing is crazy. It was crazy to begin with. The irony is that who was Barack Obama's opponent in 2008?
John McCain.
John McCain. Where was John McCain born?
I want to say Arizona. I'm not.
Nope. No.
Yeah, he would have been born overseas somewhere.
He was born in Panama. So the myth was Barack Obama was not eligible to be president of the United States because he was born in Kenya. But nobody pointed out, well, why is John McCain running for president? He was born in Panama. In fact, legally, I think most scholars that looked at it says, if you came out of an American vagina, you could be on Mars, and you would still be eligible to be president of the United States. But of those two candidates, the only one that was born in the United States was Barack Obama. The whole thing was a stack of lies that many people, including one Donald Trump, apparently still believe. You remember the story in the 2016 election cycle, I think it was, about how the pedophiles and Hillary Clinton ran a child abduction, human trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and how a guy showed up with a gun at the pizza parlor and was arrested? Well, thank goodness no lies have ever spread on the internet and caused any other violent acts in our history, right? More on that later. But Pizzagate helped spawn a deeper and darker and stranger and yet more widespread universe of mythology, including what to me is one of the weirdest things that seems to have power, even amongst some Republican members of Congress, the whole QAnon theory, that there's a secret agent Q who is resisting the federal government. And you know, it sounds weird and fictitious only because it is. And yet it's fervently believed. And, you know, that kind of information and misinformation can lead to some deaths, to an insurrection, for an attempt to stop an American election. I mean, how far do we have to let this go before we recognize that the disinformation age that we live in has serious consequences? By the way, I chose this famous news photograph from January 6th because what's actually happening in this picture? The protesters, amongst other things, attacked equipment used by the news media. They attacked news crews, which is a hostile relationship between protesters and news media isn't necessarily something new. But in general, if you hold a protest, do you want the news media to notice? Yeah. So it's kind of a, we are so against the news media that then when they come to spread our message, we will attack them. Okay, so I'm going to zoom through this one pretty quickly. This is taking longer than I expected it to. That never happens in class. I'm always exactly right on time, right? There have been lots of theories about 9/11. And I'm sorry to list some of these because some of them are pretty loathsome. And I apologize in advance, but I think we need to recognize the nature of what we're dealing with. One of it is that it was an inside job of some sort. It was a controlled demolition. There were explosives in the building. Somebody in the World Trade Center conspired to bring the World Trade Center down. At the Pentagon, there was no plane, there was a missile. I remember listening on NPR to a worker who saw the plane fly right overhead before it flew into the Pentagon, and yet people somehow concoct the missile thing. I guess because there's not much pieces of plane left when you fly a jet into a building. Perhaps most evil and the one I'm reluctant to list, but it is nonetheless a popular one, and we need to recognize it, is the bizarre Jewish conspiracy. The myth that thousands of Jews didn't go to work that day because, I don't know, the secret Jewish government that actually controls the world and controls the U.S. conspired to create this somehow, something. And there are all kinds of other government conspiracies. It was testing of a secret U.S. weapon. It was staged by the government in order to be able to, take foreign incursions. Sometimes the conspiracies from some other government, but it's the whole government conspiracy idea. And of course, part of the problem is that 9/11 was a conspiracy. And we don't completely understand the conspiracy, and there's a lot that we're still learning about it. And that's part of the nature of these weird things that happen. We think of 20 years as a long time, but it's really not. And there's a lot that we haven't unfolded yet about this very large event. But clearly, it's interesting that as a result of 9/11, we invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq when all of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. But there's geopolitical reasons for that. And a lot of unanswered questions about that. So why do we live why do we struggle so much with even agreeing what the facts are, what reality is? I don't have the answers here, but I have some speculation, and I'll freely admit that this is speculation. I think partly the reason that we tune into this, and again, correct me if I say this wrong, because this is your area of expertise and not mine, but it's something called confirmation bias. Right, it's the tendency for us to understand any data that we get in a frame of reference that confirms what we already believe. And if we have a range of choice, if there's a buffet of information, we're going to reach for the part of that buffet that confirms what we already believe. And we live in a society where the internet has grown exponentially since 9/11, and where the buffet of data and not data has just grown immensely. It's like the worst cruise ship in the world where there's no way you're not going to land when you're super fat. And I think that when you have information overload, when you don't have time to even scroll through your own news feed, when you only see what's at the top in Facebook or what's at the top in Twitter, that I think that bias becomes more important, right? Because you don't have time for it all. What are you going to pick? You're going to pick the stuff that tastes good to your brain already. I'm glad. I've got a dentist nod, so I think I'm okay. I'll keep going. And that also has to do with the reward for the media environment. How does Facebook make money?
Users clicking on.
Yeah, it's an advertising medium. Why is traditional media so poor and Facebook so rich? Because the ad dollars migrated where the eyeballs migrated. Now, Facebook is a marketing company. It's a very sophisticated marketing company because it can really target based on what you see. And it's not the only big marketing company. How does YouTube and Google make money? Right? What gets clicks gets shared and amplified. And it's partly through personal choice, but it's also because of the what we get shown. That was the big thing that blew up about Facebook over the weekend on the 60 Minutes report. Hardly surprising in my mind, but a giant American corporation is emphasizing profits. Clutch my pearls. I don't honestly see a lot of malicious intent there, even on behalf of Google or Facebook. I do think that they need regulation. I do think that they're too powerful. But I think that they're behaving in a way that we would expect them to behave. They're like, I don't know, the Coca-Cola company. Is Coca-Cola going to tell you to drink less Coke, even though it's healthier for you if you drink less Coke? No, they sell Coca-Cola. Right? They're going to want you to drink as much as they can get you to drink. right? Maybe they'll buy a water company, maybe they'll create some diet things, they'll try and figure out what their consumers want and give it to them. But that's honestly what's happening here. These big social media companies are trying to deliver to the users the experience that the users want. In fact, Facebook's in a bit of trouble right now, not just because their technology is getting so big that it can go down on a Monday afternoon, but because their audience is migrating. The kids are on Snapchat and TikTok. And Facebook is becoming a bit more of an old person's tool. I feel very mixed about this. What I mean by distrust of authority is distrust of authority in a broad sense. We don't trust experts in any field. A pandemic comes and we want to argue back at Anthony Fauci as if we had a doctorate in medicine and had studied infectious diseases for years. On the other hand, I don't think I want a world in which we blindly trust authority, right? Part of the reason culturally we distrust authority is to some extent, in our lived experience, authority has done a lot to be distrusted, right? I mean, that explains the conflict in Vietnam, basically. A conspiracy in which the government wasn't being honest with us about what it observed, wasn't clear about its own aims, and didn't have an exit strategy. Which has become a bit of a pattern in some of our foreign engagements. We can't be honest about what the situation is or what the likely outcome is, which, of course, breeds a lot of distrust. Comparing the previous president to this president on the honesty scale, there's a big difference, but Joe Biden hasn't always been straight either, particularly on Afghanistan. Misinformation is also very stubborn. And again, Dennis, you'll have to watch me here and see how far away from reality you get. I'm doing pretty good, and I'm feeling pretty good so far, so that's good. Part of what happens, I think, on the internet is a weird psychology of being anonymous that will allow us to comment on things in a way that we would never say to somebody's face. Again, our communication patterns evolved at a time when the only way to directly communicate with anybody was to speak directly to them. And then we invented writing, and we were able to record information, which is great because as a species we could build a base of knowledge. We can learn from Socrates and Plato, whereas dogs today can't learn from dogs that lived in ancient Greece at the time of Socrates and Plato, which is great, except that's not the way that we're used to judging information, right? Over the millions of years, well, I guess I shouldn't say million. Our species hasn't existed for millions of years. Our temporal range is less than 1 million years. Over hundreds of thousands of years, yeah, thank you. The scientist didn't have to correct me there. Over the hundreds of thousands of years that we've existed, writing in modern civilization is like 10,000 years old. Less than 10% of our temporal range as a species. I think our temporal range is around 500,000 years, so less than 5%. You do the math because I can't, I'm a writer. But anyway, we're used to judging information by judging the source of that information, and I think our judgments are a bit better when we're watching the old lady and trying to see whether she'll cross the street or not. Not necessarily when we're reading the words, which requires a lot more thought and effort and triangulating and verification. So the anonymity of it is part of the problem, and I think that there's a weird intimacy, right? When am I on the internet writing my blogs, which my wife doesn't read, although I urge my students to read them. It's usually at night after I'm done at work when I should be going to bed. When it's 11 o'clock and you're writing something on C.R. Garden Joe, you feel like you're alone, right? It's just you and the computer. And what I hope that I remember, Audrey will tell you that I haven't always remembered it the way I should, but I usually remember it, is that whatever you put there is public display. But it doesn't feel public when you do it. You're not in front of other people, so you don't see them looking at you. which I think is part of what infuses the nature of this kind of communication. It's also true that it's hard to prove that something is not true. Well, how do you know that the vaccine doesn't shrivel testicles and cause infertility? Well, there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't, but I mean, it's hard to prove that that's an impossibility and never happened and never will happen, right? What we don't know, we don't know. And so that's something that helps to spread disinformation. We crave explanation, we need explanation, we want explanation, and it explains every sitcom ever produced in American television. We want the problems to be wrapped up in half an hour if possible. Otherwise, we want a compelling narrative that we can come back next week and have it wrapped up. Finally, right, this didn't exist. I mean, cell phones existed in 2001. But honestly, most cell phones in 2001 were used as telephones. Right? The iPhone didn't exist. The BlackBerry was a big thing. And over time, this morphed to the point where I use this all the time, but the thing I'm least competent with this thing on is it's hard for me sometimes to answer the damn phone because I've got to do some swiping and touching, and sometimes I accidentally hang up. And yet I use it all the time because the least useful thing it's for is for making phone calls. Although it happens occasionally, but that's a minority of this use, right? What do I use this thing for?
Literally anything else.
Everything else, right? I got a whole bunch of likes on a recent post that I posted at Mount Mercy because I took a picture of my sandaled feet and said I'm morphing into Neil Bernstein. Right. Well, I thought it was hilarious too. But this is all I did this is the only instrument I had to use to create that content. I have the ability to do that in a way that I didn't before, and that's typical. That's part of what's happening in the information environment, right? In 2001 or 2005, sure, people would create a video and post it on Google Video and spread disinformation. Today, they don't need the computer at all. Here we go.
You're filming yourself. You are.
Wow. Isn't it ironic? One thing that I don't like about this phone is it seems to launch apps that I didn't want it to launch when I don't expect it to.
Because it's got a computer brain.
Well, I'm sure that the robot overlords thought that I wanted to film myself. Google heard me say film. Which one, silly as that is, that might literally be true. Pardon me while I try and shut off my overlord here.
Is that possible?
No.
Yeah.
Siri is always listening. Anyway, so where do we go from here? Again, I'm not in the business of giving you solutions. I just want to ruminate on it. And my talented editor this year has actually a tattoo of this on her ankle. Your today is not forever. I think it's a quote from a novel called Turtles All the Way Down. And I take comfort in that. It's hard to see where we go and what the way forward is. And hopefully the way forward doesn't lead to a worse place before it gets to a better place, but that's hard to know. But it's not going to lead to the same place, at least. Now, whatever else we know about this information environment, we know that it's not stable. We hope that when it evolves, it goes in a better direction than a worse direction, although honestly, we can't be sure at this point. Our pandemic experience shows that. We as a species, this country was not where this virus started. And yet, disproportionately, this country has suffered a way higher mortality rate, higher than I think every other developed country. Many developed countries have suffered a lot. Not everybody's New Zealand, although even New Zealand's starting to get more trouble with the Delta variant. Why has it been worse here than it was in frickin' China where it started? Because we won't agree on what we're supposed to do and follow the simple steps. That's a problem. Is education the answer? Well, partly yes, although honestly part of the problem we're struggling with now is education is very politicized. Right? Think of the Iowa legislature recently passing a bill that's trying to control what Iowa social studies teachers will say about racism in America. That if we don't allow them to talk about it, it must not be a thing, right? Yeah, it's part of the answer, but we're not grappling with even the parameters of that experience and how we shape it in a better way, is I guess my point. One of the things that I think we need to remember that's both hopeful and scary is that we tend to think of the media manipulating us. And I have heard lots of professors, legitimately, I don't mean to say this is a bad thing for professors to say, because the media is a powerful force in our lives, and it does do a lot to us. But we have to recognize that these days, especially with social media, media isn't something external that's controlling us. We are the media. What's at the top of the algorithms on Facebook and Google are what people are clicking on. Now, clicking isn't even a private act, it's a public act that helps construct the environment that we're in. Because of artificial intelligence, the media is partly the way that we shape the media, which can be so scary when we can't agree on facts, but at least it means that we can't think of ourselves as powerless, that we can't do anything. No, for years now, we have had the power to shape our media experience. We have to sort of take ownership of that and shape it the way we want to shape it. So, now I guess my final thing before we have our comment period is, take some care as we all move forward together and try and figure this complicated knot of stuff out. Watch what you believe and who you believe, right? And watch what you share. I think probably one of the best things we can do is hesitate. If you see something that's so juicy, it seems too good to be true, wait 24 hours and see if Shirley Sherrod actually said that. Because chances are there's a rest of the story you don't know yet. Okay, so this is the time when I open it up. If anybody wants to make large bribes to my coven of youth converting Wiccan professors, that's a conspiracy thing. It's meant to be a conspiracy joke. But yeah, actually, I open it up for comments or questions or your thoughts that maybe my thoughts might have prompted. So.
Okay. My frustration is that I have parents that do not do the internet, do not have smartphones, as my mother calls it. She has a dumb phone when somebody tries to get her to do something on a smartphone. But the thing is that all of the conspiracy theories that you've ever heard since in the last probably 10 years, they believe every single one. So what
Well, they're getting it from somewhere. Partly it might be Fox News.
Yeah, exactly. That was my thing, and it's like it was my understanding that when Fox News was allowed to start being like tabloid journalism, I think that's when a lot of this stuff started. And I think that it used to be that when you went to the grocery store, you picked up a tabloid. Now you have people my parents' age that don't know the difference. And I can argue the point, but I get told I'm arguing. So
you don't understand the reality. You don't understand you've been fed the line all along, and I know the truth. There's a big, besides this whole internet thing, honestly, the other thing that's been happening in the background is the Rush Limbaughing of media. That is, Rush Limbaugh was a popular radio talk show host, and the existence and growth of Fox News and the whole right-wing alt-media landscape partly stems from that experience. And partly what's happening, I suspect, with your parents is they're not directly experiencing the smartphones, but people that they know are. And they're hearing things and believing those things. And those things are echoed by Fox and Friends. And so there's still... I don't think you can exist in the United States, even in a rural community in Iowa, without this having a big influence on you, even if you don't have this. Because it's part of the proliferation and strength and fervent belief in those things. And, again, we are a tribal species. We are used to people that we're comfortable with. We exchange information with them, and we tend to believe what they believe. And
I was just to my doctor's office 2 days ago, and even my doctor says the patients do not even believe out of their own doctor's mouth that the vaccine doesn't have like a isotope in it, you know. So they don't even believe it from their own doctors.
Yeah, it's. I guess that's true, and it's a difficult thing to try and figure out how to confront. And as I say, I honestly don't have the answer, but I think you're exactly right, and I think that there is a relationship. This didn't cause that, but this accelerated and exacerbated that environment. And here we are trying to figure out, well, how do we go forward when so many people have checked out of news, when local news sources have dried up, when the sources of information are the electronic equivalent of the tabloids, and for some reason, when people went to the grocery store and they bought the Weekly World News, most of them knew they were doing it for entertainment purposes, but when they watch Fox and Friends, they don't realize that they're not watching a news program.
Back in the 60s and 70s, and I think I'm accurate in what I'm about to say, is you basically, to get your news, you just have the 3 major networks. Today, you still have the 3 major networks, but you have so much outside of the 3 major networks.
Right, and there were all kinds of problems with that environment too, but at least there was a bit more trust in institutional sources of information, sometimes misplaced because there were some, lies that were perpetrated as a result. I'm always of two minds about the internet. Part of what it does is it does give the voiceless voice, and it allows the expression of things that major media might have suppressed, and that's not always a bad thing, right? But the audience, for some reason, seems to have lost its way in navigating those waters. Sometimes I speculate, I know it's politically impossible, so that's the reason I didn't even suggest it as a solution, but I wish that we had way more robust funding of public media, because we sort of need something that we can trust, although an awful lot of people wouldn't trust that.
Yeah, well, so I'll comment this way. So I go back a little bit further, but ultimately when you were going there, the news used to be, you had somebody that fact-checked things. You had people that, it was more about just giving information. It was a public service to have the news. They weren't expected to make money. CNN, I said, you mentioned Fox, but CNN started the 24-hour news cycle. And at first, everybody tuned in because it was new and you can get the news whenever you wanted. And then they started losing viewership. And then they started changing what we wanted to sell, because what sells in commercials or anything else is emotion. Facts do not sell. This is why us scientists have a problem ever selling what we have without some type of marketing or somebody else changing it to an emotional conversation. So once you did that and you started changing that, now you realize viewership is tied to more of our emotional shows. And then we changed what news is. And now you blow up with the internet and all of these others, and now everybody quickly with the emotion, and then it spreads. And then, as you pointed out, by the time people actually fact check it and say, oh, it's already done. I go back, the first time I got this email was like 93, 92, somewhere around that range. So the internet was fairly new to the general public. The email came in and said to my CEO, who said, you guys can't go to New Orleans because they're harvesting kidneys there. And he didn't, there's no fact checking, nothing. And he said, he came there and there was an email that was a warning, went through all the DOD, and then found out, no, that really never happened.
Yeah, Jim, I think I'm just in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of move on a little bit. I kind of agree with most of what you said. The one asterisk I would put is that those media companies that provided that public service news in the 1960s and 70s were enormously profitable. And they were driven by a profit motive. That was basically what created our idea of objective journalism in the first place, was partly the penny press model, the recognition of publishers that if we're not so partisan, if we seem to be reporting objective information, we can sell the New York World to anybody. And there is a higher ideal and a public service to journalism. But it was most powerful when it sort of coincided with the business model that made that activity also very profitable.
So I'm wondering, I'm thinking about some of the ripples right after 9/11 happened, of the way that the story got told. So within a day or two, the story coming out of the White House is, if you all go shopping, our economy won't collapse. So it's patriotic to go shopping. Do you remember that narrative? Like, that was the official party line.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, we have to attack Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. And I'm just wondering, like, some of those things that we can look back and say, those were exactly the wrong things to say and probably weren't even true. The ripple effects of those things on some of the distrust.
Yeah. Again, I wish that culturally we Americans recognize that there are some authorities that you should trust. But I would also have to say that many large institutions in our culture have done an awful lot to earn distrust. And I think that is part of the ripple effect there. You know, the whole Iraq incursion, the second war in Iraq, based on, over time, it was just like what we said was the case was not the case. And in many ways, it was worse than Vietnam. Not as big as Vietnam, not as many people died, not worse than that. Well, an awful lot of Iraqis died. But worse than Vietnam because it represented one of the few times in history that America engaged in an aggressive foreign war. When we had not been attacked by the people that we did attack. Not the only case. I mean, the Spanish-American War is kind of fishy too, honestly. But
How does all of this connect to like the modern cancel culture thing? I know that's a broad question.
The modern what culture?
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture?
Be like something will come out that a celebrity did something. It sort of connects to the Me Too movement.
Yeah, well, one of the issues with the internet, and again, I think the internet is a new communication phenomenon that we don't completely understand and don't know how to deal with. It is, cancel culture is sometimes a code word for a particular justification for bad behavior. It's not a term that I'm particularly fond of, but I can't deny that there isn't a reality there, that we do tend to react too quickly and too emotionally, especially when it's something that somebody said some time ago. And I remember the first time I wrote Ragbri back in 2007. I did it with my son, who is a programmer for a little company called Microsoft. And he had a whole bunch of pals from Microsoft that were writing Ragbri. And it was weird because they would share all these anecdotes about what they were observing in the computer universe. And the big thing in the computer universe was the internet. And so all of their anecdotes were about the ways in which people got in trouble because of information that they either posted or was discovered on the internet. And there was a little tagline that they always amended, like a little reminder that they were making to each other. They always said, "The internet never forgets." Which is kind of true, because our information, once it's there, you can't get rid of it. But weirdly, while the internet never forgets, part of what I worry about is that we, as a culture, have deep amnesia, that we don't remember context, that we jump to conclusion way too quickly. And yeah, I think that it does connect to that, Gwen. I think you're right. There is a tendency to jump to conclusion way too quickly.
Joe, I don't know if you saw today, today's Washington Post, there's a little quiz you can take. It says, will you fall into the conspiracy theory rabbit hole? Take our quiz and find out.
Oh, okay.
And apropos for the...
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
It's a conspiracy.
And there are sites that you can use. There's a site called Fact Check. There's a site called PolitiFact, and those are pretty good, except of course they aren't. They themselves are humans interpreting events, and so they're not perfect. And a lot of people don't believe them because it comes from the media, and you can never believe the media.
Related to the PolitiFact thing, in our ethics textbook reading for today, it actually mentioned that during the 2016 election cycle, PolitiFact had disinformation ads on it just because of how algorithms work. So I guess, is there a way that you can like filter ads that I mysteriously don't know about, having grown up on the internet?
That's a very good question. I mean, I've noticed that myself. I have several blogs that I maintain, and I'm not responsible because the service that provides me with the power to blog is the service that puts the advertising there. And I don't know if something analogous is happening to PolitiFact, where they're just allowed to post and promote it, and somebody else is choosing the advertising for them. But that might be partly what's going on. I mean, I see that on the Gazette site. You know, the Gazette's a fairly reputable local newspaper, but some of the clickbait things that you'll see are, you know, clearly weird clickbait things that are on the surface of them are not reputable. And I always wonder a little bit about who is coming to a reputable news site and clicking on that clickbait. But there's got to be somebody, because otherwise it would never be there. Have I ground you to a halt? I hope. Do you think, was it torture for your daughters, or do you feel like you got something on it? Oh, good. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Go and maintain a healthy skepticism. Triangulate your information, but don't spread information until you have a chance to check and see if somebody reliable is telling you it, or if it comes from some weird clickbait thing.